Chapter 1. First Contact. The vast expanse of space stretched infinitely, punctuated by the silent flicker of distant stars. Aboard the Varkashi cruiser, Silence of the Void, Captain Lyria watched Earth loom larger in the viewport. The blue and green planet, with swirling white clouds, was deceptively tranquil from afar. "Commander Rethik, status report," Lyria commanded, her voice echoing slightly in the spacious command deck. "Approaching Earth's orbit, Captain. All systems nominal, and the human leaders have been notified of our arrival. They await your communication," replied Rethik, a seasoned officer whose loyalty to Lyria was as unwavering as his discipline. Lyria nodded, turning to her communications officer, a young and eager Varkashi named Felspa. "Open a channel to Earth's leaders. Let's see what these humans have to offer." Felspa worked his console, and soon, the view screen shifted from the view of Earth to the interior of a human command center, where a group of Earth's top officials had gathered. Among them, a man in a suit stepped forward. He was older, with graying hair and a calm demeanor that seemed at odds with the nervous looks of his colleagues. "Captain Lyria, I am President Alan Carter of the United Earth Government. We welcome you with peace and hope for fruitful dialogue between our peoples." Lyria studied him with a critical eye, her expression unreadable. "President Carter, I am here to assess whether your species is ready for integration into the Starbound Alliance. We seek partners, not liabilities." President Carter's smile faltered, but he maintained his composure. "We understand the gravity of this meeting, Captain. We are eager to demonstrate our progress and our worthiness to join your alliance." Beside Lyria, Rethik whispered, "They seem sincere, Captain, perhaps too eager." "Eagerness can be a mask for desperation," Lyria replied quietly, her gaze still fixed on the screen. "Tell me, President Carter, about your advancements in technology and culture." As Carter launched into an explanation of Earth's recent innovations and cultural achievements, Lyria signaled Felspa to mute the audio. "Keep him talking. Observe them. I want to know everything about their body language and their technology visible in the background." "Yes, Captain," Felspa responded, his eyes scanning the multiple feeds for any sign of deceit or hidden strength. The discussion continued, with Lyria interjecting to challenge Carter's points or to demand clarification. The dialogue slowly revealed not only the accomplishments but also the struggles of humanity. Their wars, their environmental challenges, their societal fractures. Yet, it was the humans' persistence in facing these trials that caught Lyria off guard. Despite her reservations, she found a grudging respect for their tenacity. As the call neared its end, Lyria addressed the human leader once more. "President Carter, your world has indeed faced many challenges. We will consider what we have learned today and inform you of our decision." "Thank you, Captain Lyria. We hope for a positive outcome," Carter replied, his voice steady, his team behind him nodding in agreement. As the screen went dark, Lyria turned to Rethik. "Prepare for a closer orbit. I want a detailed scan of their defense capabilities. We must understand fully whom we are dealing with." Rethik nodded, issuing the necessary commands to the crew. The cruiser moved silently closer to Earth, its sensors extended like the feelers of some great cosmic creature. "Whatever comes next," Lyria mused aloud, "we must be ready. For better or worse, our path lies forward, intertwined with these humans, at least for now." And with that, the crew of the Silence of the Void braced themselves, ready to delve deeper into the complexities of humanity. Chapter 2. Misunderstanding. The meeting room aboard the Silence of the Void was sterile and efficient, filled with holographic interfaces and muted lighting that gave the space a calming, if slightly clinical, ambience. Captain Lyria sat at the head of the table, flanked by her first officer Rethik and a small contingent of Varkashi diplomats. Across from them, on the other side of the holographic display, sat Earth's delegation. President Alan Carter was there again, composed as always, but this time he was joined by Dr. Elliot Spencer, a linguistics and cultural expert. Elliot was in his mid-30s, tall and wiry, with an easygoing demeanor that contrasted sharply with the stiff formality of the diplomats around him. His presence had been requested after the previous meeting revealed gaps in understanding between the two species. Captain Lyria, Carter began, we've provided the data you requested, including an overview of our current technological capabilities, our societal systems, and our cultural achievements. We hope this will clarify any remaining questions about our readiness to join the Alliance. Lyria kept her expression neutral, her sharp, sapphire blue eyes fixed on Carter. Your data is thorough, but it lacks the nuance we require to make an informed judgment. As I said before, we do not merely seek potential partners with technology. We seek allies who can contribute meaningfully to the Alliance. Elliot, who had been sitting quietly, cleared his throat and leaned forward. Captain Lyria, if I may, perhaps the issue isn't just the information we've provided, but how it's presented. Different cultures often interpret data in unique ways. It might be helpful if I explain some of our traditions and historical contexts that aren't immediately apparent in the raw figures. Lyria glanced at Rethik, then back at Elliot. I will allow it, Dr. Spencer, but make it concise. We do not have unlimited time. Elliot nodded and began outlining key moments in human history, touching on art, philosophy, and the social movements that had shaped Earth's current global society. As he spoke, he tried to emphasize the depth of human culture rather than its flaws. Lyria's expression remained guarded, though she occasionally tilted her head, her brow furrowing slightly, as if reconsidering something. When Elliot paused to catch his breath, Lyria said, Your passion is evident, Dr. Spencer, but we have encountered other species with similar stories. Species that failed to adapt to the complexities of interstellar collaboration. What sets humans apart? Elliot hesitated, then offered a small smile. I think it's our ability to find common ground, Captain. Even after centuries of division, we're still striving to unite, to collaborate on challenges larger than ourselves. That drive, to keep learning, to keep reaching out, is what makes us unique. Lyria's eyes narrowed. And yet, your history is riddled with conflicts. Wars, betrayals, self-inflicted wounds. How can we trust that your kind will not bring such instability into the Alliance? Before Elliot could respond, one of the Varkashi diplomats leaned forward, murmuring something in Lyria's ear. She frowned, then turned back to the humans. It appears there was an incident. A human vessel approached one of our outposts without proper clearance. Your people claim it was a misunderstanding, but the timing is suspicious. President Carter stiffened. I assure you, Captain Lyria, we are investigating that incident thoroughly. It's entirely possible it was a navigational error or a miscommunication on our end. Lyria raised a hand. Be that as it may, it highlights the need for stricter protocols. If we are to proceed, we must ensure that these misunderstandings do not occur again. Elliot jumped in, sensing an opportunity to defuse the tension. Captain Lyria, perhaps we could collaborate on a joint project. A small one at first. Something that would allow us to work together and build trust, without the risks of full integration right away. Lyria leaned back, considering his words. Rethik, sitting beside her, said, It is not without precedent. A joint initiative could provide valuable insight into their capabilities and reliability. After a long pause, Lyria nodded. Very well, Dr. Spencer. Propose a project. If it meets our standards, we may consider it. Elliot smiled, his relief evident. I'll prepare a detailed outline and send it to your team for review. Thank you, Captain. As the meeting adjourned, Lyria and her officers remained in the room, reviewing the day's events. Lyria tapped her fingers on the table, her sharp nails clicking softly against the smooth surface. Rethik, what do you make of him? She asked. The human? He seems earnest, perhaps too much so, but he handled himself well today, and his linguistic skills are noteworthy, Rethik replied. Lyria nodded slowly. It may be that Dr. Spencer is an exception among his kind, or perhaps he is an example of their potential. Either way, we will keep a close watch on him. She stood and walked to the viewport, staring out at the blue-green planet below. They will have their chance, but we will not lower our standards. Let's see if they can prove their worth. Rethik gave a short bow. Understood, Captain. As the silence of the void drifted silently in orbit, preparations began for the joint project that would determine the future of human and Varkashi relations. And though Lyria would never admit it, she found herself curious about these humans and about the peculiar linguist who had stood his ground against her skepticism. Chapter 3. Unlikely Alliance. The ship hummed with activity as Captain Lyria strode into the main briefing room. The large chamber was filled with holographic displays and Varkashi crew members working at various stations. She cast a glance toward the central display, which showed a detailed projection of Mars. Nearby, her first officer, Rithik, was quietly conferring with another officer. "Report," Lyria demanded, her voice cutting through the background chatter. Rithik turned to face her. "We have a potential crisis, Captain. The human settlement on Mars' Elysium base has detected a rogue comet on a trajectory that could cause significant damage. The humans have requested our assistance in devising a solution." Lyria raised an eyebrow. "The humans are seeking our help to clean up their mess?" "To be fair, Captain," Rithik replied cautiously, "they had no way of predicting this comet's course. It's an unusual object, and its trajectory only became clear recently. They've asked for our expertise because their technology alone may not be sufficient to divert it." Lyria crossed her arms, her sharp gaze lingering on the comet's holographic path. "And what exactly do they expect us to do?" Rithik stepped closer to the display, pointing at several highlighted points along the comet's path. "The humans have proposed a joint operation. We would deploy one of our gravimetric tugs to alter the comet's trajectory while they provide additional power and guidance. They've also suggested that a small team of our specialists join their engineers at Elysium base to oversee the operation." Lyria considered this for a moment, then gestured toward the console. "Open a channel to the human delegation." Moments later, the holographic screen shifted to reveal President Carter, flanked by Dr. Elliot Spencer and several other human representatives. Carter nodded in greeting. "Captain Lyria, thank you for responding so quickly." "Spare me the pleasantries, President," Lyria said bluntly. "Explain why you believe my crew and I should risk our lives for your settlement." Elliot stepped forward before Carter could respond. "Captain, I know you have every reason to doubt us, but this is an opportunity for both our people. If we succeed in averting this disaster together, it will show that cooperation is not just possible, but mutually beneficial. You've seen our willingness to learn and adapt. Give us the chance to prove it." Lyria's gaze flicked to Elliot. His calm confidence intrigued her. He wasn't trying to flatter her or appeal to her emotions. He was simply stating his case. She glanced at Rithik, who gave her a subtle nod. "Very well," she said. "We will send a team. But understand this, Dr. Spencer. If this operation fails due to human incompetence, I will not hesitate to terminate our collaboration." "Understood, Captain," Elliot replied without hesitation. "We won't let you down." Several days later, Lyria found herself aboard a smaller Varkashi vessel en route to Elysium base. Beside her sat Elliot, along with a handful of Varkashi and human technicians. The journey was tense and quiet at first, but Elliot eventually broke the silence. "You've worked on a lot of these operations before, haven't you?" he asked, glancing at Lyria. She gave him a sidelong glance. "I have participated in numerous planetary defense initiatives, yes." Elliot nodded. "I've only ever read about this kind of technology. It's incredible. I imagine the engineering involved is—" "Dr. Spencer," Lyria interrupted. "We are not here to exchange pleasantries. Our task is to prevent a catastrophe, not to marvel at technology." Elliot chuckled softly, undeterred. "I understand. I just find it fascinating. That's all." Lyria said nothing more, turning her attention back to the console in front of her. Elliot didn't push further, sensing that he'd done enough to break the initial ice. Instead, he focused on reviewing the mission parameters. When the shuttle landed at Elysium base, Lyria was the first to step out. The base was a sprawling complex of modular habitats and research facilities, all encased under a transparent dome that protected its inhabitants from the harsh Martian environment. Human engineers greeted them, their expressions a mix of relief and curiosity as they laid eyes on their alien counterparts. A senior engineer, a middle-aged man named Patrick Hayes, approached Lyria and Elliot. "Captain Lyria, Dr. Spencer, welcome. We're ready to begin whenever you are." Lyria nodded curtly. "Show me the equipment. I want to ensure that everything is in proper working order." Hayes gestured for them to follow. "Of course, we'll give you a full tour of the control room and the power modules." As they moved through the facility, Elliot walked alongside Lyria, occasionally pointing out features of the base's infrastructure. At one point, he motioned toward a large window that provided a view of the Martian surface. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said quietly. "A barren world, but there's something compelling about it." Lyria stopped and glanced out the window. The rusty, desolate landscape stretched to the horizon. "It is unique," she admitted. Elliot smiled. "Not the word I'd use, but I'll take it." Hayes cleared his throat, bringing them back to the task at hand. "If you'll follow me, the control room is just ahead." The next several hours were spent running diagnostics, calibrating equipment, and synchronizing the Varkashi and human systems. Lyria found herself surprisingly impressed by the humans' ingenuity. Though their technology was less advanced, their resourcefulness allowed them to make the most of what they had. Throughout the preparations, Lyria and Elliot often found themselves working side by side, reviewing calculations and double-checking procedures. At one point, as they both leaned over the same console, their hands brushed. Elliot looked up at her, slightly startled, but Lyria seemed unfazed, her focus on the screen. "Sorry," he murmured, stepping back slightly. "It's fine," she replied briskly. "Just focus on the data." By the end of the day, the team was ready. The comet's path had been carefully plotted, and the combined efforts of Varkashi and human technology stood poised to divert the incoming threat. As the final countdown began, Lyria stood next to Elliot in the control room, both of them watching intently as the operation commenced. The room was filled with tense silence as the gravitational tugs activated, their combined forces beginning to nudge the comet off its deadly course. Lyria and Elliot exchanged a brief glance, a silent acknowledgement of the stakes and the shared responsibility they bore. When the comet's trajectory finally shifted, cheers erupted from the human engineers. Elliot turned to Lyria, a relieved smile on his face. "Looks like we did it." Lyria allowed herself the faintest hint of a smile. "It appears so." As the control room buzzed with celebration, Lyria and Elliot stood quietly together, sharing a moment of calm in the midst of the noise. Though their cultures and perspectives remained vastly different, the success of the operation hinted at a future where collaboration might not just be possible, but necessary. Chapter 4: Close Encounters. The hum of the shuttle's engines was steady, though it lacked the power and precision of Lyria's Varkashi vessels. She leaned back in the co-pilot's seat, arms crossed as she stared at the various readouts on the dashboard. The journey back to their mothership was meant to be routine, just a short trip after a successful mission. Elliot was at the helm, his hands steady on the controls, though Lyria noted his occasional furtive glance in her direction. "Something on your mind, Dr. Spencer?" she asked, her tone neutral but firm. Elliot smiled faintly, keeping his eyes on the console. "Just making sure we stay on course, Captain." Lyria's gaze didn't waver. "I've been on many flights, Dr. Spencer, and I can tell when someone is preoccupied. Speak plainly." He sighed, finally glancing at her. "I was just thinking about the operation, how well it went despite the odds. Honestly, I didn't expect things to come together so smoothly." Lyria tilted her head slightly, studying him. "Why wouldn't you? Your engineers proved competent enough, and we provided the expertise required to succeed. The plan was sound." "Yes, but people, and by people I mean humans, often find a way to make things messier than they should be," Elliot said with a half-smile. It was nice, for once, to see everyone working in harmony. Lyria raised an eyebrow, but before she could respond, a warning light began flashing on the console. Elliot frowned, leaning forward. "That can't be right." "What is it?" Lyria demanded, already unbuckling her harness to examine the readouts more closely. "It's an engine instability warning," Elliot said, his voice tight. "Could be a malfunction in the primary fuel system. I'll try rerouting the—" Suddenly, the shuttle jolted violently. Lyria grabbed onto the nearest handhold to steady herself, her sharp reflexes preventing a fall. Elliot cursed under his breath, his hands flying over the controls. "Stabilizers are failing," he muttered. "We're losing altitude." Lyria shot him a sharp look. "What do you mean, losing altitude? We're not even near a planetary surface." Elliot grimaced. "I mean, we're drifting out of the navigational corridor and headed straight into the debris field from that old asteroid belt. We need to stabilize before." Another jolt cut him off as alarms began blaring. Lyria moved quickly to the auxiliary panel, pulling up schematics. "Switch to manual control. I'll reroute power to the secondary engines." Elliot nodded, his movements swift but controlled. "On it." As they worked side by side, Lyria couldn't help but notice his calm under pressure. Despite the dire situation, he followed her instructions without hesitation, his confidence growing with every successful adjustment. She matched his pace, her fingers dancing over the controls, recalibrating systems and overriding safety locks to squeeze out every ounce of power from the struggling shuttle. "We're still spinning," Elliot said. G slowed but didn't stop entirely. Lyria gritted her teeth, manually adjusting the angle of the wings to counterbalance the remaining momentum. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the shuttle steadied. The alarms quieted, leaving only the hum of the engines. Lyria exhaled sharply, wiping her brow. Elliot slumped back in his seat, letting out a long breath. "Well," he said, his voice light with nervous relief, "that was fun." "Hardly," Lyria replied, but her tone was less harsh than usual, and there was a hint of amusement in her eyes. "You handled yourself well, Dr. Spencer. Perhaps you're not as inept as I first assumed." Elliot chuckled, shaking his head. "I'll take that as a compliment." They both fell silent for a moment, the weight of the near disaster hanging in the air. Lyria leaned back in her seat, her posture still guarded, but her gaze softened slightly as she looked at Elliot. He was calm now, his hands resting on his lap, his breathing steady. There was something about his demeanor that struck her as unusual. His quiet determination, his refusal to panic. "You're different from the others," Lyria said suddenly. Elliot glanced at her, raising an eyebrow. "Different how?" "You don't fold under pressure," she said. "Most humans I've encountered would have panicked, would have fumbled at the controls. But you remained focused. You listened." "Well," Elliot said, his tone light, "I could say the same about you. I'm not exactly used to having an alien commander bark orders at me. But you know what you're doing." It made it easier to stay calm. Lyria inclined her head slightly. "A fair observation. Perhaps you've earned a measure of my trust." "That's progress," Elliot said with a grin. "I'll take it." Their conversation was interrupted by a soft chime from the console. Elliot leaned forward, checking the display. "Looks like we've got the engines stabilized. We should be able to get back on course without any more surprises." Lyria stood, stretching her arms. "Good. Let's return to the cruiser and conduct a full diagnostic. I want to ensure this shuttle doesn't fail again." Elliot nodded, beginning the process of resetting their navigation. As he worked, Lyria watched him, her thoughts swirling. For the first time since she had met him, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that humans might have more to offer than she'd originally believed. Perhaps this human, this Elliot Spencer, wasn't just an anomaly. Perhaps he represented something more, something she hadn't yet allowed herself to see. But for now, Lyria pushed those thoughts aside and focused on the task at hand. They weren't out of danger yet. Chapter 5: Moments of Truth. The hall inside Elysium Base buzzed with subdued excitement. Engineers and scientists moved about, exchanging data pads and making last-minute adjustments to the equipment arrayed along the central platform. Overhead, the transparent dome revealed the Martian sky, an endless, rusty expanse dotted with faint pinpricks of light. Elliot stood near the main terminal, running his hand through his hair as he reviewed the readings. "I've triple-checked the calculations," he muttered half to himself. "It should be perfectly balanced now." "Should be?" Lyria's voice cut through the noise. She approached with her usual calm intensity, her sharp gaze fixed on Elliot. "We are not here to rely on hopeful guesses, Dr. Spencer. Are you certain or not?" He turned to her, smiling wryly. "I'm certain. We've tested it enough. The output's stable." She glanced at the terminal display, her expression unreadable. "Good, because if this fails, it will not reflect well on either of our species." Elliot leaned slightly toward her, lowering his voice. "You know, a little encouragement now and then wouldn't hurt. Maybe even something like, 'Nice work, Elliot.' I mean, just throwing it out there." Lyria raised an eyebrow. "You wish to be coddled?" "Not coddled," he replied with a laugh. "Just acknowledged. It's been a long few days." She considered him for a moment, then gave the faintest nod. "You have done acceptable work." Elliot grinned. "I'll take it." Before they could continue, an alarm sounded. A sharp, piercing tone that immediately drew the attention of everyone in the room. Lyria spun toward the main console. "Report!" she barked. An engineer stepped forward, holding a handheld display. "There's an unauthorized vessel approaching the dome perimeter," he said quickly. "It's not one of ours. Can you identify it?" Lyria demanded. "We're still scanning," the engineer replied, his voice tight, "but it's not broadcasting any recognizable alliance signal. It could be a rogue ship or hostile," Lyria finished grimly. She turned to Elliot. "Stay here. I'll handle this." Elliot shook his head. "Not a chance. If something's going on, you're going to need backup." "I do not require your assistance," she said sharply. "You'll only be a liability." "Maybe," Elliot said, his tone steady, "but I'm coming anyway." Lyria regarded him for a long moment, then let out a small, frustrated breath. "Very well, but stay close and follow my lead." They hurried through the base, making their way toward the outer observation deck. As they moved, Elliot tried to match her pace, but she was quick and sure-footed, her movements fluid and precise. He found himself impressed, not for the first time, by her grace under pressure. When they reached the observation deck, the rogue ship was visible just outside the dome's protective barrier. It was a small, sleek craft, unmarked and silent. Lyria immediately began issuing orders into her comm unit, calling for additional security personnel. Elliot watched the ship through the transparent dome, his unease growing. "What do you think they want?" "If they were here to negotiate, they would have signaled," Lyria said, her voice cold. "This is not a friendly visit." As she spoke, the ship emitted a pulse of light, brief and bright, followed by a low rumble that reverberated through the base. Lyria's hand went to the sidearm at her belt. "They're scanning us," she muttered, "looking for weaknesses." Elliot stepped closer, lowering his voice. "So what's the plan? Do we sit here and wait, or—" "We prepare for the worst," Lyria said. "If they attempt to breach the dome, we will—" Another rumble cut her off, this one louder and accompanied by a sharp tremor that shook the observation deck. Elliot stumbled, but Lyria caught his arm, steadying him. "Stay focused," she said firmly. He nodded, forcing himself to remain calm. "What's their next move?" "Likely an attempt to disable our power systems," Lyria replied. "If they knock out the dome's shielding, the atmosphere alone will kill everyone here." Elliot swallowed hard. "That's not the kind of worst I was hoping for." Before Lyria could respond, another pulse of light flared from the ship. The lights inside the base flickered, and the hum of machinery momentarily dipped. Lyria immediately raised her comm again, barking commands. Elliot could hear her ordering engineers to reroute power, to bring backup systems online. Her comm authority was reassuring, but the urgency in her voice told him just how critical the situation was. "We can't just stand here and wait for them to break through," Elliot said, his voice tight. "Is there anything we can do to stop them?" "I am working on that," Lyria snapped, her attention still on the comm. Elliot hesitated, then said, "What if we send a decoy signal? Something to throw them off, maybe make them think we're evacuating." Lyria lowered the comm slightly, her sharp gaze locking onto him. "A distraction? It could buy us time," Elliot said. "Time to reinforce the shield, to figure out what they're really after." Lyria considered this, then nodded curtly. Not a terrible idea. She turned back to the comm and began relaying Elliot's suggestion to the engineering team. As the base's systems adjusted, the rogue ship seemed to hesitate, its lights dimming slightly. Lyria glanced at Elliot. "It appears your idea is working," she said, "but it won't hold them for long." Elliot gave a nervous smile. "I'll take what I can get." As the minutes passed, the rogue ship's activity slowed. Security teams arrived on the observation deck, armed and ready. Lyria coordinated with her officers, making sure every defensive measure was in place. Eventually, the rogue ship backed away, disappearing into the Martian haze. Lyria's posture remained tense, her eyes on the spot where the ship had vanished. Elliot could see the wheels turning in her mind, the calculations of what had just happened and what it meant. "Do you think they'll come back?" he asked quietly. "Yes," she said simply. "But next time we'll be ready." Elliot nodded, then said, "You know, you're not half bad in a crisis." Lyria looked at him, her expression softening just a fraction. "And you are not entirely useless, Dr. Spencer." He laughed. "That's high praise coming from you." Lyria didn't smile, but there was a hint of amusement in her eyes. "Come. We have much to prepare before they return." As they left the observation deck, Elliot found himself feeling a strange sense of pride. Lyria had trusted his idea, and it had worked. In that moment, they had been more than just a human and an alien, more than just colleagues. They had been a team. Chapter 6, Healing and Understanding. The medical bay's subdued lighting gave the room a calming quality, even though the atmosphere within it was tense. Captain Lyria sat upright on a padded examination chair, her left arm immobilized in a regenerative cast. She wasn't used to stillness, and the small, sterile space left her restless. Across from her, Elliot Spencer stood with his arms crossed, glancing between her and the diagnostic readouts displayed on the wall. "You don't have to hover," Lyria said dryly, her voice sharper than she intended. "The medics are handling it." Elliot smirked, leaning against the wall. "You know, most people would at least say, 'Thank you,' after someone saves their life." Lyria's blue eyes met his. "I don't recall asking for assistance." He let out a soft laugh. "I know. That's what makes it even more impressive. Imagine that, a human rushing to protect you without waiting for permission." Lyria looked away, her gaze settling on the floor. "I don't require protection." "You're welcome," he said lightly, ignoring her deflection. "Besides, it wasn't just about you. If something had happened to the captain, it would have caused chaos. I was thinking about the bigger picture." "Of course," Lyria replied evenly, though she couldn't completely hide the flicker of gratitude in her tone. A Varkashi medic entered, carrying a set of medical instruments. She performed a quick scan of Lyria's arm, then nodded. "The tissue is regenerating well, Captain. You should regain full mobility within a day or two." "Thank you," Lyria said curtly. The medic left as quietly as she'd come, leaving the two alone once more. Elliot took a step closer, his posture more relaxed. "You don't have to keep pretending you're invincible, you know?" Lyria glanced at him. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" He raised an eyebrow. "You think I haven't noticed how much pressure you put on yourself? You've got an entire crew looking to you for guidance, not to mention your people back home. It's okay to admit you're not made of stone." She studied him for a moment before responding. "You presume too much." "Maybe," he said with a shrug. "But I also know what I saw back there. You were willing to take a hit for your team, and that says something." Lyria's lips tightened, and for a long moment, she said nothing. Then, quietly, she asked, "Why did you do it?" "Do what?" Elliot said, genuinely unsure. "Intervene. Risk yourself." Her voice was measured, but there was a genuine curiosity there. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Because it felt like the right thing to do. I've spent a lot of time studying how your people work, how you think. You're not all that different from us. You put up walls, sure, but underneath it you care about your crew, about the mission. I saw that and I thought, maybe, just maybe, it was worth stepping in. Lyria didn't look at him, but her head dipped slightly, as if in thought. Your reasoning is unexpected. He chuckled. I'll take that as a compliment. For the first time, Lyria allowed herself to look directly at him, her usual sternness giving way to something softer. You have been surprisingly capable. Elliot's grin widened. You just called me capable. I think that's the nicest thing you've ever said to me. Don't let it go to your head, Lyria replied. But there was a hint of a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Too late. He leaned back against the wall again. You know, you might actually be starting to like me. Lyria's expression turned neutral again, but she didn't deny it outright. Instead, she simply said, You've proven yourself useful, Dr. Spencer. I'll take that as a victory, Elliot said. Another pause settled between them, but this one wasn't awkward. It felt almost comfortable, as if they were finally settling into a rhythm. Elliot broke the silence after a moment, his tone more serious this time. Look, you've been through a lot. I'm not going to pretend I fully understand everything you're dealing with, but you don't have to do it alone. Sometimes it's okay to lean on someone else. Lyria's gaze lingered on him. I am not accustomed to such offers. Well, he said, his voice lightening again. Consider it an open invitation. I'm not going anywhere. Lyria inclined her head slightly, a gesture that might have been her version of thanks. I will consider it. Elliot smiled. Good enough for me. He stepped away from the wall and headed toward the door. I'll let you rest. Try not to scare off the medics while I'm gone. Unlikely, Lyria replied dryly, but there was a trace of humor in her voice. As the door closed behind him, she leaned back in the chair, her mind turning over the events of the day. Elliot Spencer had proven to be an unexpected variable, one that had not only earned her respect but had begun to challenge her long-held beliefs. She wasn't sure what to make of him yet, but for the first time, she felt a spark of curiosity rather than skepticism. For now, she would let that curiosity grow. Chapter 7. A New Vision. The command center aboard Silence of the Void was filled with the faint hum of holographic displays. Lyria stood at the central console, her sharp blue eyes scanning the latest intelligence reports. She had summoned Elliot to discuss the upcoming summit, though she wasn't entirely sure why she felt it necessary. His insight, while often unconventional, had proved unexpectedly valuable. When Elliot entered, he gave a small wave. You called? Lyria glanced up. Yes, Dr. Spencer. I require your perspective on these preliminary arrangements. Elliot moved closer to the console, studying the holographic projections. This is for the summit you mentioned? The one meant to bring human and Varkashi representatives together. Correct, Lyria said. If we are to form a lasting alliance, both sides must understand the terms, the expectations. Sounds straightforward enough, Elliot replied, squinting at the rotating charts. What's the sticking point? Lyria gestured toward a section of the display. Several human delegates have raised concerns about cultural compatibility. They claim that our traditional protocols are too rigid, too demanding. They're not wrong, Elliot said, glancing at her cautiously. Lyria turned to face him fully. Explain. He leaned on the edge of the console. Humans are used to a certain level of flexibility. We improvise, we adapt. It's not about disrespecting protocols. It's about having the freedom to act quickly when situations change. I think the delegates are worried that if the alliance is too structured, it'll stifle that adaptability. Lyria crossed her arms, considering his words. The alliance thrives on structure and order. Without clear guidelines, chaos ensues. I'm not saying throw out the rulebook, Elliot said, but maybe there's room for compromise. Some flexibility in the protocols so they don't feel like they're constantly walking a tightrope. Lyria's gaze softened slightly. A balance, then. Exactly, Elliot said. If you can show them that the Varkashi are willing to meet them halfway, I think it'll go a long way toward building trust. She nodded slowly, turning back to the holograms. You believe this will make the difference? I do, Elliot said, because it's not just about rules. It's about showing that we respect each other's ways of doing things. That's how partnerships start, by meeting in the middle. Lyria was silent for a moment, then tapped a few commands into the console. I will adjust the proposal. If it succeeds, the human delegates may be more open to cooperation. Elliot smiled. I think you'll see it makes a big difference. As Lyria worked, Elliot stepped back, watching her with curiosity. You know, he said after a moment, you've changed a lot since we first met. She paused, turning her head slightly. Have I? Yeah, he said, leaning against the wall. Back then you were, let's just say, not exactly thrilled about humanity. Lyria raised an eyebrow. And now? Well, now you're asking for advice from a human linguist, Elliot said with a grin. That's progress. She let out a small, almost imperceptible chuckle. Perhaps. Or perhaps I simply find your perspective unique. I'll take that as a compliment, Elliot replied, his tone light. It was not intended as an insult, Lyria said, returning her focus to the display. You have proven insightful on more than one occasion. Wow, Elliot said, pretending to stagger. Careful, Captain. I might start thinking you actually like having me around. Lyria turned to him, her expression calm but her tone carrying a faint hint of amusement. Do not let it go to your head. Elliot laughed, raising his hands. Wouldn't dream of it. They worked together for another hour, fine-tuning the summit's proposal and discussing potential compromises. As they collaborated, Lyria found herself less guarded around Elliot, allowing their conversation to flow more freely. His candidness, while at times irritating, had a way of breaking through her formality. When they finally finished, Lyria straightened and faced Elliot. This proposal should satisfy the delegates. I will present it at the next briefing. Elliot nodded. Sounds good. I think they'll appreciate the effort you're making. Effort is not the issue, Lyria said. It is the outcome that matters. True, Elliot agreed. But making the effort shows them you're serious about working together. That counts for a lot. She studied him for a moment, then said, You are more perceptive than I initially thought, Dr. Spencer. Thanks, he said with a grin. I try. As he turned to leave, Lyria called out, Dr. Spencer. He stopped, looking back at her. Yes, your insight today was valuable, she said. I will not forget it. Elliot's grin, Ming's surface. Captain Lyria stood at the head, her posture rigid, her expression carefully controlled. Beside her, Elliot adjusted his tie, glancing around the room at the delegates. You ready for this? Elliot asked quietly. Lyria glanced at him, her sharp gaze softening slightly. Readiness is irrelevant. We must do what is necessary. That's one way to look at it, Elliot replied, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. But if it helps, I think we're in a good position. People on both sides are starting to see the value in working together. Lyria nodded slightly. Perhaps. But a single meeting will not erase years of distrust. True, Elliot agreed. But it's a step, and every step counts. Before she could reply, the room quieted. President Carter, seated across the table, rose to his feet. If everyone is ready, he began, I'd like to open this session. Captain Lyria, as our honored guest, the floor is yours. Lyria stepped forward, her voice measured and steady. Representatives of Earth, members of the Starbound Alliance. We gather today not to dwell on our differences, but to find common ground. The path ahead is not without challenges, but we stand here as proof that collaboration is possible. Her words were met with polite nods and murmurs of agreement. She continued, outlining the terms of a proposed cultural exchange program and joint research initiatives. Elliot watched her, impressed by her composure. She carried herself with a quiet authority that demanded attention without arrogance. It was clear she had won over many of the delegates, even if they wouldn't admit it openly. When Lyria finished, Carter stood again, offering a respectful bow of his head. "Thank you, Captain. Your proposals are both thoughtful and forward-thinking. I believe they will serve as a solid foundation for our future partnership." Elliot couldn't help but smile. It was the closest thing to a glowing endorsement he'd heard from Carter, who had been skeptical at first. Lyria gave a brief nod in acknowledgement, her expression remaining calm. As the meeting progressed, various delegates raised questions and offered minor amendments. Lyria addressed each point with precision, never showing frustration or impatience. She had mastered the art of diplomacy, something Elliot found both impressive and, in a strange way, reassuring. During a short recess, Elliot approached her at the side of the room. "You're doing great." She raised an eyebrow. "Was there any doubt?" "Not from me," he said. "But it's good to see everyone else catching on." Lyria's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. "Your optimism is persistent. Someone's got to balance out all that Varkashi seriousness," Elliot replied with a grin. When the session resumed, the delegates formally voted on the cultural exchange and joint research initiatives. The vote passed with a comfortable majority. Elliot felt a wave of relief as the room broke into scattered applause. Lyria remained composed, but he could tell she was pleased by the outcome. After the meeting adjourned, Lyria and Elliot walked out onto the observation deck. The dome above them revealed the endless Martian sky, and the faint glow of Earth was just visible on the horizon. The atmosphere was quieter now, the tension from the conference finally lifting. "You've come a long way since we first met," Elliot said, leaning on the railing. "Back then, I wasn't sure we'd even make it this far." Lyria stood beside him, her gaze on the distant stars. "Nor was I." "And now?" he asked. "Now I see the potential," she replied. "Not just for cooperation, but for growth. We have much to learn from each other." Elliot smiled. "That's about the nicest thing you've ever said about humanity." "It is the truth," Lyria said simply. She turned to him, her expression more open than he'd ever seen it. "And you, Dr. Spencer, have proven to be more than an interpreter. You have been a valuable ally." "Ally?" Elliot repeated, raising an eyebrow. "You sure you don't mean friend?" Lyria hesitated, then said softly, "Perhaps." Elliot chuckled. "I'll take it." They stood in silence for a while, watching the faint glow of Earth in the distance. Lyria spoke first. "This is only the beginning. There will be difficulties ahead." "There always are," Elliot said. "But I think we're up for it. Besides, we've got you at the helm. I'm sure you'll keep us all in line." Lyria's lips twitched in a subtle smile. "And you, Dr. Spencer, will no doubt keep things interesting." Elliot grinned. "That's the plan." As they turned to head back inside, Lyria paused for a moment. "Elliot." He looked back at her, surprised by her use of his first name. "Yeah. Thank you," she said. Her voice was quiet, but the words carried weight. He nodded, his smile softening. "Anytime." Together, they walked back into the base, the sound of the door hissing shut behind them. In that moment, Elliot felt a strange sense of pride, not just in what they had accomplished, but in the connection they had forged. It wasn't just about diplomacy or alliances anymore. It was about trust, about finding common ground, and about two very different people learning to stand side by side. As they stepped into the main corridor, Elliot glanced at Lyria. "So, what's next?" Lyria met his gaze. "We continue forward, one step at a time." And as they moved forward, the path ahead no longer felt so uncertain. Together, they had laid the groundwork for something new, something worth pursuing.